In every nation's history, there are stories of triumph that become legends, and stories of tragedy that become mysteries. Rarely does one story encompass both. For Australia, that story belongs to a ship. She was a celebrated hero, the pride of a young navy, a vessel that seemed invincible, earning fame and glory in the crucible of war. And then, in the vast, empty expanse of the Indian Ocean, she vanished. Not just sunk, but erased, taking every single soul aboard with her, leaving behind only whispers, rumors, and the conflicting testimony of her enemies. This is the story of His Majesty's Australian ship Sydney, a tale of spectacular victory, fatal overconfidence, and a 66-year search for the truth that lay hidden 2.5 kilometers beneath the waves. Our story begins not in Australia, but on the bustling slipways of Wallsend-on-Tyne in England in 1933. Here, the keel was laid for a new light cruiser for the Royal Navy, intended to be named HMS Phaeton. But halfway across the world, the Royal Australian Navy was looking to modernize its fleet. The Australian government decided to purchase the still under construction cruiser, and on September 22, 1934, she was launched not as Phaeton, but as HMAS Sydney, named for the nation's largest city and inheriting the legacy of her decorated World War I predecessor. She was a modified Leander-class light cruiser, a formidable design for its time. At just over 562 feet, or about 171 meters in length, she displaced nearly 9,000 tons when fully loaded. Her 4 Parsons-geared turbines could push her through the water at a swift 32 knots. She was protected by a 3-inch or 76mm belt of armor over her machinery spaces, and her deck was sheathed in steel 1-inch thick. But her real strength lay in her teeth. Her main armament consisted of 8 6-inch guns, mounted in 4 twin turrets, 2 forward and 2 aft. These guns could hurl a shell over 14 miles, that's nearly 23 kilometers. For anti-aircraft defense, she carried 4-inch guns and a dozen heavy machine guns. And for punching holes in enemy warships, she was equipped with 8 21-inch torpedo tubes. Critically, she was also one of the first Australian warships fitted with ASTIC, an early form of sonar, giving her a vital edge in hunting submarines. Commissioned in September 1935, HMAS Sydney was the cutting edge of Australian naval power. After a period of peacetime duties, including representing Australia at the coronation of King George VI, the world plunged into darkness. When World War II erupted in September 1939, Sydney was immediately put to work on patrol and convoy escort duties in home waters. But the real test, the forge where her legend would be cast, was half a world away. In May 1940, with Italy poised to join the war on Germany's side, Sydney was dispatched to the Mediterranean, joining the British Mediterranean Fleet based in Alexandria, Egypt. The Middle Sea was about to become one of the most fiercely contested naval battlegrounds of the entire war. Sydney and her new commander, the brilliant and respected Captain John Collins, were thrown straight into the fray. The ship and her crew quickly earned a reputation for efficiency and aggression, conducting shore bombardments, sweeping for enemy vessels, and escorting vital convoys to the besieged island of Malta. They were constantly in harm's way, facing threats from Italian warships, submarines, and aircraft. The crew became hardened veterans, their ship a familiar and feared sight to the Italian Regia Marina. The pinnacle of her Mediterranean service, the action that would make her a household name back in Australia, came on July 19, 1940. Sydney, accompanied by a handful of British destroyers, was sweeping off the northwest coast of Crete, near Cape Spada. In the early morning light, they spotted them. 2 Italian light cruisers, the Bartolomeo Colleoni and the Giovanni delle Bandiere. On paper, the Italians had the advantage. They were faster, and combined, they outgunned Sydney. But Captain Collins was an astute tactician, and his crew were masters of their craft. He maneuvered his ship brilliantly, using his superior gunnery to his advantage. At a range of over 10 miles, or 16 kilometers, Sydney's 6-inch guns roared to life. The Australian gunners were astonishingly accurate. Shell after shell slammed into the Bartolomeo Colleoni. The Italian cruiser was crippled, her boilers knocked out, leaving her dead in the water and burning fiercely. While the Giovanni delle Bande Nere fled under a smokescreen, the accompanying British destroyers closed in and finished off the helpless Colleoni with torpedoes. It was a stunningly decisive victory. Sydney had sustained only minor damage, a single hit to her forward funnel, and suffered only one minor casualty. She and the destroyers then performed the grim but necessary task of rescuing over 500 Italian survivors from the sea, even as Italian bombers arrived and tried to disrupt the operation. When Sydney steamed back into Alexandria harbor, she was met with a hero's welcome. The entire fleet manned their rails and cheered as she passed, her forward funnel proudly sporting the hole from the Italian shell. The Battle of Cape Spada was a massive morale boost for the Allies, and for Australia, it was a moment of immense pride. HMAS Sydney was no longer just a warship. She was a symbol of Australian fighting spirit. A glamour ship, her crew celebrated as national heroes when they finally returned home in February 1941 to cheering crowds in the city she was named for. After her triumphant return, Sydney, now under the command of Captain Joseph Burnett, resumed the more mundane but equally vital tasks of patrol and convoy escort in the familiar waters around Australia. It was during one of these missions that fate would intervene. In early November 1941, she escorted the troop ship Zealandia to the Sunda Strait before turning back for her home port of Fremantle in Western Australia. It was a routine trip, the kind of mission she had performed countless times. But unknown to her, a silent, deadly hunter was lurking in the same waters, and their paths were about to cross. To understand the tragedy that followed, we must first understand the weapon that was stalking the Indian Ocean. She was the German auxiliary cruiser, Kormoran. From a distance, she looked like any other nondescript merchant freighter. She was originally the Steiermark, a civilian cargo ship, but beneath her harmless exterior, she was a wolf in sheep's clothing. The Germans had transformed her into a commerce raider, a surface predator designed to blend in, get close to unsuspecting Allied merchant ships, and then unleash a devastating surprise attack. Her civilian facade was a masterpiece of deception. Hidden behind collapsible panels, fake deck structures, and disguised holds was a formidable arsenal. 6 5.9-inch guns, 2 anti-tank guns, 5 anti-aircraft cannons, and most lethally, 6 torpedo tubes, 4 of which were hidden below the waterline. She carried sea mines and even 2 small seaplanes for scouting. Under the command of the cunning and experienced Fregattenkapitän Theodor Detmers, the Kormoran had been on a year-long reign of terror, sinking or capturing 10 Allied merchant ships totaling over 56,000 tons across the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. She was a proven killer, a master of disguise and ambush. On the afternoon of November 19, 1941, about 130 miles, or 210 kilometers, west of Shark Bay, Western Australia, the two ships met. Kormoran, low on supplies and heading for a secret rendezvous, was caught off guard when a warship appeared on the horizon. It was Sydney. For Captain Burnett on the Sydney, the appearance of a lone merchant ship in this empty stretch of ocean was immediately suspicious. He began to challenge the vessel, demanding it identify itself using signal lamps. This is where the cat-and-mouse game began. Captain Detmers on the Kormoran knew his only chance was to maintain his disguise for as long as possible. He hoisted a Dutch flag and identified his ship as the Straat Malacca. A real Dutch freighter he knew was scheduled to be in the area. But his crew were slow and seemingly clumsy with the signals, a deliberate ploy to buy time and lure the inquisitive cruiser closer. For over an hour, the two ships steamed on a parallel course, with Sydney continuing its interrogation. Why wasn't the Straat Malacca on its expected course? Why was its response to the secret call signs so delayed and incorrect? Every naval instinct should have been screaming, "Trap." Yet, for reasons that went to the grave with him and his crew, Captain Burnett made a decision that has been debated and analyzed for decades. He decided to get closer. Much closer. He steered Sydney onto a course that brought him almost directly alongside the Kormoran, closing the range to a mere 1,600 yards, or about 1,500 meters. This was point-blank range for naval guns. At this distance, Sydney's superior firepower, armor, and range-finding capabilities were almost completely negated. She had willingly given up every single advantage she possessed. The most likely theory, is that Burnett intended to send a boarding party to capture the ship before its crew could scuttle it. This was a common practice, but to do so, he brought his ship into a kill zone from which there would be no escape. Aboard the Kormoran, the German crew were at their action stations, hidden from view, their guns trained on the Australian cruiser. Captain Detmers watched as Sydney steamed alongside, her own guns trained on him, but apparently not fully ready for immediate action. Some of her crew could be seen on deck, casually observing the strange merchantman. Detmers knew it was now or never. At approximately 5:30 p.m., just as Sydney signaled, "Show me your secret sign," he gave the order. The Dutch flag came down, the German battle ensign was run up, the camouflage dropped away, and the Kormoran unleashed hell. The opening salvo was brutally effective. Her 5.9-inch guns, fired at near-perfect range, slammed into Sydney's bridge and fire control director. This single blow was catastrophic. It likely killed or incapacitated the senior officers, including Captain Burnett, and instantly crippled the ship's ability to coordinate an effective response. Her forward turrets, deprived of central control, fired only a few inaccurate shots before being silenced. Within minutes, another German salvo struck Sydney's aircraft and its fuel tank, causing a massive, intense fire amidships. But the fatal blow came from below the waves. A torpedo, fired from one of Kormoran's hidden underwater tubes, struck Sydney just forward of her A and B turrets. It tore a huge hole in her hull, right near the forward magazines. The pride of the Australian Navy was a crippled, burning wreck in less than 5 minutes. But HMAS Sydney did not die without a fight. Even with her command structure shattered and her midsection an inferno, her crew fought back with incredible bravery. Her aft turrets, X and Y, operating under local control, continued to fire, and they found their mark. Shell after shell from Sydney's rear guns smashed into the Kormoran. They tore through the raider's unarmored hull, starting fires and, crucially, hitting the engine room. The German ship was mortally wounded, her engines destroyed, leaving her dead in the water and with uncontrollable fires raging through her. The battle, a short, vicious, and incredibly bloody affair, was over in less than half an hour. Both ships were doomed. As darkness fell, the two dying vessels drifted apart. The Germans, their own ship now a burning wreck, last saw Sydney moving slowly south, glowing on the horizon from her fires, heavily down by the bow. They reported seeing her glow until about 10 p.m., and then a distant flicker before she vanished completely into the night. Around midnight, with the fires on Kormoran about to reach her mine hold, Captain Detmers gave the order to abandon ship. He scuttled his vessel, and 318 of his 398-man crew made it into lifeboats and rafts. They were the only witnesses to what had happened. Back in Australia, HMAS Sydney was now overdue. At first there was no alarm, just a quiet expectation, but as the hours turned into days, a dreadful silence descended. Sydney was not responding to signals. She had not appeared in Fremantle. On November 24th, a full 5 days after the battle, the first sign of trouble emerged. Survivors were found in a lifeboat, but they weren't Australian, they were Germans. As more and more German sailors were picked up by searching ships or stumbled ashore in remote parts of Western Australia, the horrifying truth began to dawn. They told a shocking story. They were the crew of the raider Kormoran, and they had fought and sunk HMAS Sydney. The nation was stunned. It seemed impossible. How could their champion, the victor of Cape Spada, be sunk by a converted freighter? Surely, it was a trick, a lie. The Royal Australian Navy launched one of the largest air and sea searches in its history. Day after day, aircraft and ships scoured the vast, empty ocean. They found more German lifeboats. They found some debris, including an empty Australian Carly float, riddled with holes. But of HMAS Sydney and her 645 men, her 641 naval personnel, 3 RAF airmen, and 1 civilian canteen worker, they found nothing. Not a single survivor. Not one body. It was as if the ship and her entire company had been swallowed by the sea. The loss was a staggering blow to Australia, a country already strained by the war. It was the largest single loss of life in the history of the Royal Australian Navy, and it created a wound in the national psyche that would fester for decades. With no Australian survivors, the only account of the battle came from the captured Germans. This immediately created an environment of suspicion and doubt. Were they telling the whole truth? Many found it hard to believe their story. The loss of Sydney became a national obsession, spawning a host of conspiracy theories. Some claimed the Germans must have fired on Sydney before raising their battle flag, a war crime. Others suggested the Germans had machine-gunned Australian survivors in the water, explaining the lack of bodies. The most persistent theory was that a Japanese submarine had been involved, that it had secretly helped the Kormoran, or perhaps even finished off the crippled Sydney. This theory was fueled by the proximity of the attack on Pearl Harbor, which occurred just a few weeks later. For over 60 years, the fate of HMAS Sydney remained Australia's most painful and enduring military mystery. Books were written, inquiries were held, but without the wrecks, there could be no definitive answers. The families of the 645 men were left in a state of limbo, with no grave to visit and no certainty about their loved ones' final moments. The only thing that could provide closure was to find the ships. But they lay somewhere in a vast, deep, and unforgiving part of the Indian Ocean. The quest to find Sydney became a holy grail for marine archaeologists and wreck hunters. For years, the search seemed impossible. But with advances in deep-sea survey technology and the tireless work of researchers who painstakingly re-examined the German accounts and ocean drift models, the search area was gradually narrowed down. The effort was spearheaded by the renowned shipwreck hunter David Mearns. In early 2008, his search vessel, equipped with sophisticated side-scan sonar, began to systematically comb the seabed, 2.5 kilometers below the surface. On March 12, 2008, they found something. It was the wreck of a large ship, heavily damaged. It was identified as the Kormoran. This was a monumental breakthrough. Knowing the Kormoran's location allowed Mearns to use the Germans' own testimony about the battle to calculate Sydney's most probable final position. Just 5 days later, on March 17, 2008, about 12 nautical miles away from the Kormoran, the sonar detected another shape on the ocean floor. It was HMAS Sydney. The 66-year mystery was over. Remotely operated vehicles were sent down to survey the wrecks. The images they sent back were haunting and definitive. They told the story of the battle with chilling clarity. Kormoran lay in 2 pieces, torn apart by the scuttling charges. HMAS Sydney sat upright on the seabed, a ghostly, silent tomb. The damage was exactly as the Germans had described. Her bow was completely gone, sheared off just in front of her A turret, consistent with a massive explosion following the torpedo hit. Her superstructure was riddled with shell holes, concentrated around the bridge and forward section. All her turrets were trained to port, pointing towards her final enemy. The underwater footage confirmed the German account of the battle was, in all its key details, accurate. There was no evidence of a third-party submarine or any other foul play. The truth was simpler and in many ways more tragic. HMAS Sydney had been lost not to a conspiracy, but to a fatal error of judgment. Her captain, for reasons we will never truly know, had brought his magnificent ship too close to a disguised and ruthless enemy. He had paid for that mistake with his life and the lives of every man under his command. The discovery of the wreck brought a profound sense of closure to the families and the nation. The site is now a protected war grave, the final resting place of 645 sailors, a permanent memorial on the silent floor of the Indian Ocean. The story of HMAS Sydney remains a powerful and poignant chapter in Australian history. It is a story of heroism and fame of a ship that was the pride of her nation, but it is also a cautionary tale of the brutal realities of war, where a single mistake, a moment of overconfidence, can lead to unimaginable tragedy. She was the hero and the ghost, a legend of victory and a mystery of defeat, and her story will be remembered as long as Australians sail the seas. We've journeyed through the triumphs and the tragedy of this incredible warship, but the ocean of military history is vast and deep, with countless more stories waiting to be told. We want to hear from you. What piece of military history, legendary machine, or untold story should we investigate next? Let us know in the comments. Your idea could become our next feature documentary. The history of warfare is filled with complex decisions, incredible bravery, and sometimes devastating mistakes. If you believe, as we do, that understanding these stories is crucial to understanding our world, then make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Hitting that button ensures you won't miss our next deep dive into the conflicts, characters, and machines that have shaped our past and continue to influence our present. Thank you for joining us on this voyage.